Hello and good evening from Frankfurt, from the Deutsches Architekturmuseum to our second season of our wonderful series Kontext, Kontrast, Kontinuität, Heritage Conservation and Urban Development. My name is Andrea Jürges. I'm the Deputy Director of the museum and will be the moderator of this evening. The debate series we started last year in November started out as a substitute because we couldn't meet in real life for a symposium. But it proved to be always interesting, not only to us, but to a wider audience since we do this online. So luckily, we are allowed to continue this. Thanks also from the federal sponsoring program Nationale Projekte des Städtebaus. And we do this in partnership with ICOMOS, Docomomo, the Liebling House in Tel Aviv, and the Ernst May Gesellschaft in Frankfurt, and with the Urban Planning Department here in Frankfurt as well. So the start of this second series, again, we have 4 lectures coming up every month. One is a topic which we kind of ended with the last session, was outstanding 20th century heritage. And today we want to look at how to live in it, how to use it, and what are the advantages. And I'm very happy to welcome, first of all, here in Frankfurt, Cornelius Boy. He's an architect, he's right beside me. He's an architect and renovated one of the houses of the Neuen Frankfurts from Ernst May, and he will talk more about this later. And also here, joined in Frankfurt, is Markus Gwechenberger. He is from the Urban Planning Department and a co-conspirator and inventor of this entire series. We will start our evening, well, we have 4 lectures coming up, all of them, of course, brief, before we start our discussion. And to those of you who already joined before, you know that the discussions are always another very important element of this entire event. So it's not just the presentations, but rather the discussions later on. For those of you who joined via Zoom, we are happy to promote you to panelists so you would be visible and actively participating in the discussion by video and audio if you just send us a note via the Zoom chat or Q&A session. Just let us know and we can just change you from being just a participant to become a panelist. Just like, for example, Jörg Haspel, he is a panelist and also a co-conspirator of this entire series and very involved. And hopefully Sharon is also already online. She's the program director of the Max Liebling House. So hello, good evening, Sharon. And maybe more joining us, Iran and Imbal from Israel. I'm looking at the commentator team. And if you have any questions you want to post either on YouTube, Facebook, or Zoom, we are happy to then add this into our discussion. We have a commentator team to my left, and they would old-fashioned hand me the questions or comments via paper. So that is the long introduction into our current evening. Where do we start today? Last time we discussed more generally how is 20th century heritage architecture being integrated into urban development. And today we want to hear from those who live in it or who are involved in the conservation planning. Difficult word for a German. And we want to look at which characteristics may be shared by the housing estates of Neues Frankfurt, of Berlin, and the White City Tel Aviv with the Sydney Opera House, aside from being built in the 20th century. What defines life today in all those buildings which were at the time of construction considered modern and well-liked? How does, or maybe not, thinking of this opera house, it might be more controversial when it was finished. How does one connect with others living in a heritage-listed building? And how can this environment be adapted to current requirements? What are possible restrictions, challenges, and opportunities? All of us who deal with this face. Also, this museum, even though it's only built in the 1980s, is partially protected as a monument, but of course we need to adapt it. We need new windows, we need better technical equipment, especially with more hot summers. How can we all this integrate in an existing building? So it's a very up-to-date topic. What is necessary? Where is it necessary to act with particular care? I think Sheridan Berg will talk more about this in detail. World Heritage Sites are also living organisms which develop and need possibilities for adaptation. We have invited Ben Buschfeld, who is an inhabitant of the Hufeisensiedlung in Berlin, Cornelius Boy, inhabitant of the Ernst May estate in Frankfurt-Braunheim, and from Israel, Brad Pinchuk, architect living in the White City, Tel Aviv, will join us, as well as Sheridan Berg from Ecomos Australia, with expertise on Sydney's Opera House and its ongoing adaptations. We will start with a short presentation by Ben Buschfeld. Let me see, he politely sent me a little bit about himself. He's the owner of buschfeld.com, a graphic and interface design. He's a multidisciplinary designer, and he runs tautshome.com, Tautesheim, a rentable museum dedicated to the work of Bruno Taut. And he's also one of the organizers of the event Triennale der Moderne, and one of the activists, as I call them, initiating a number of awareness-raising projects at one of the Berlin modernist housing estates. Ben, I hand over to you to introduce all the projects you are involved with and one in particular. Welcome and thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you very much for invitation and introduction. I actually have prepared a few slides, and I now would like to share my screen with you. I think that's now everybody should see.
Working.
Okay.
Yes.
So here you see the Hufeisensiedlung, which is probably the most prominent of the 6 housing estates that have been listed by the UNESCO in 2008. I would like to show you a cascade of projects that evolved during the last 15 years, triggered by a process of privatization. These are the 6 Berlin modernist housing estates. They were built in between 1913 and 1934 to provide solutions in a time of severe housing shortage. So their history is very much comparable to the Neues Bauen in Frankfurt. 5 out of the 6 Berlin estates have been realized under the city planning director Martin Wagner on the left. 4 are based on designs by Bruno Taut. My Beloved Neighborhood is probably Taut's best known work. The design shows his great mastership, achieving individual quality, although the construction is based on serial components. The estate is a mixture of village-like row houses and more urban-looking apartment blocks. The layout provides something like the missing link between the Garden City movement, which you see in section 1 and 2, and large-scale planning with serial rows of apartment blocks in section 6. So what was the starting point for our activities? 1998, 1 year after we moved here, the city administration of Berlin sold the entire portfolio of the GHAG, the most productive housing association in the 1920s in Berlin. This portfolio of around 10,000 flats ended up being traded on the stock market. Since that, our estate has largely been turned into individual property. The almost 700 row houses with garden now belong to more than 600 individual owners. The almost 1,300 flats finally belong to Deutsche Wohnen, which is the biggest landlord in Berlin. Although the estate is a listed monument, you can imagine that this created a difficult situation for proper maintenance. A formal framework for some of the earlier projects was the founding of a non-profit civil association entitled the Friends and Supporters of the Horseshoe Estate, which was in 2007. As a graphic designer, I supplied the association with design artifacts that express our local bondage. Since 2008, the association organizes a big street feast every year. This social event can also serve as a carrier for monument protection issues. This picture, for instance, shows how a copy of the UNESCO document is handed over to the long-term resident Helga Schönfeld, who was actually born in the estate in 1926. Project number 2 was pushed by my wife. She's a landscape architect, Katrin Lesser. And as you see, large parts of the public greens were in a very poor condition. In her role as a garden monument expert, she suggested to renew the original design by garden architect Leberecht Migge. To enforce better caretaking, she kept lobbying for almost 3 years and finally succeeded. In 2010, the estate was also a listed garden monument, which included a shift of responsibilities. Since 2010, the association runs a former shop and a shopkeeper's apartment behind inside the Hufeisen. This has established as a meeting place for neighbors and heritage tourists. The site contains a cafe, which is run on voluntary basis, and 3 rooms for which I compiled a bilingual German-English exhibition. Tourism is growing constantly, but moderately. Katrin and I guide small groups throughout the year, but the peak is on European Heritage Day, when up to 8 tours are offered by different parties. 2011, a web database was launched that hosts almost 2,000 microsites with house or apartment-specific protection plans. www.hufeisensiedlung.info could only be realized because we acquired subsidies from a program by the German government, offering co-funding for projects in national World Heritage sites. These plans are based on 2 scientific researches, one by Winfried Brenner Architekten and one by my wife. Since the altogether 679 row houses are extremely varied and need to be split up in 285 subtypes really, the plan was that residents first enter their precise street address, and after that, they could switch to a house individually microsite. This, for instance, is the microsite for the house Parchima Allee 81B. If you look at the navigation on the right, you can easily guess that each microsite offers in between 50 and 150 detailed plans. All subpages then feature illustrations that are combined with index figures. These figures reappear in a tabular overview further below, which contains all colors, measures, materials, etc. All images are backed up by a 300% zoom view, and all house-specific details can be saved and sent as generated PDF files. Using these PDFs makes it much easier to get permits and to commission a craftsman, which was utterly needed. We also included proposals for security-related or energetic upgrading. And last but not least, I added a neighbors forum plus a history and a news chapter. Unfortunately, I have to say we got problems with inconsistent new data security guidelines, so that only 2 sample houses are really open access, but this is just a piece of an iceberg. Project number 5 is a very personal project. Soon thereafter, we were involved with this big database. My wife and I started working on a personal project, a museum-like holiday home. This project is entitled Tautes Heim, which is a wordplay that gives credit to Bruno Taut and his concept of a modern interior design. www.tautes-heim.de is a small house with garden suitable to host up to 4 self-catering overnight guests. The house was in a very bad condition when we bought it in 2010, but it still contained very much original substance. We did not manage to get public funding, but decided that we need to buy the house on our own behalf. So we immediately began to restore damaged or missing parts, to remove all non-hysteric layers. We consulted color restoration experts who then provided the basis for authentic repainting. One larger issue was the reconstruction of the one missing tiled stove and the recreation of the very typical magnesite flooring. Next, all rooms were furnished true to 1920s style. And most of the smaller furniture we found at antique traders, but we also designed a number of objects ourselves. This included kitchen furniture. This is our remake of the typical Gehhack kitchen designed by Bewohner, which is fully capable for self-catering. It also includes the Bauhaus-inspired pull-out sofa in the smaller bedroom and a large folding bed in the master's bedroom. And all these in-house designs are based on historic photographs or other models. Also, the garden was recreated to historic blueprints. This served as a model for some neighbors who also started replanting historic fruit trees. Since 2012, we are renting the place to cultural-aware tourists. And in 2013, our tiny little project received the rarely granted European Union Prize for Cultural Heritage plus the Berlin Monument Award. Most of our guests come from Germany, but we also have guests from all over the world, like New York, London, or Tokyo. Project number 6. Back in the 1920s, facade-mounted typography was often part of the original design. When a local restaurant here in the Hufeisensiedlung wanted to renew its display, I helped with digitizing the original letter shapes, which was also applied at other shops. 2014, I was commissioned with the remake of a 25 square meter huge typography in Karl-Legien State, which is another UNESCO listed splendid design by Bruno Taut. 2015, I published the architectural guidebook, Bruno Taut's Hufeisensiedlung, which is based on the content of the exhibition. So it's in a way just an extended exhibition catalog. And in 2013, on the initiative of the Federal Authority of Monument Affairs, which was by then managed by Jörg Haspel, the Triennale der Moderne was launched. The Triennale is a cultural cross-regional event that links Berlin with the two Bauhaus cities, Weimar and Dessau. They cooperate to offer a widespread visit and event program every few years. As the designer within the initial brainstorming group, I take care about all print, web, and media channels. 2019, we managed to get extra funding from the German Lottery Foundation. This allowed to realize a larger program, which consisted of 20 individual partners and 115 single events in Berlin. For 2022, we plan to expand and apply for funding by the European Union. That is why we are currently looking for partners from other European cities, like some of you might represent, and that also have a rich modernist heritage. So if you want to join, please address me directly or look at our social media channels shown here. 2018 was also the European Cultural Heritage Year. This offered an opportunity to apply for funding again. So the first funded project consists of a modular traveling exhibition about the UNESCO listed estates. This exhibition is available in 2 different formats and ready to be shown elsewhere. Joining forces with the Association Berlin Forum for History and the Present, I applied for funding to design and develop a huge education website. This site is also bilingual, Berliner Moderne.de. It offers individual portraits and tours of all 6 estates. It was financed by federal and state funds and can be used on PCs and smartphones. These are a few mobile screenshots. The site offers 6 interactive maps, 350 illustrations, a MIDA glossary, 25 biographies, an introduction to the city's history, and special material for schools and students. Project number 12. The last project is still in the making. 2018, the Kulturerbestätten, a network of civil heritage organizations, was founded. Currently, we are working on the publication of a red list, so a map-based overview of endangered buildings in Berlin, which gonna be published in summer, probably. So I come to an end and like to draw a conclusion. As you noticed, I love living in a monument, and I'm an advocate of strict protection. In theory, this is legally independent of being listed as a World Heritage Site or not, but things can get complicated. From a preservation and social perspective, the selling of the Public Housing Association GEHAC was a capital political mistake that threatened large parts of Taut's heritage. But due to that, a lot of projects evolved. Many were conceived to bridge a vacuum of official care or communication. But being listed by the UNESCO definitely helps to get projects funded and to achieve more lobbying power if things don't work that well for some reason. Tourism has indeed increased, but in a very modest way. So from my perspective, the positive aspects of being a World Heritage definitely prevail.
Thank you very much, Ben Buschfeld. That was very interesting, and I think there are a few points we will get into in more detail later in the discussion. And of course, if you're talking about the Triennale der Moderne, I know one city which has plenty of modern buildings, Frankfurt. So let's go directly to Frankfurt. Thank you for this wonderful, smooth handover to Cornelius Boy. Thanks to you, Ben Buschfeld, and his insight into renovating a house of Ernst May.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. I will look for the presentation. Okay.
There it is.
First of all, I have to thank you, Mrs. Jürgens, for having the possibility to represent Neues Frankfurt as a resident of the Siedlung Braunheim, the housing estate Braunheim. My name is Cornelius Boy. I live with my family in the Siedlung Braunheim since 2011, first in a townhouse for rent, and since 2013 as a homeowner of the house Am Ebelfeld 199. I'm working as an architect for the building department of the Protestant Church in Frankfurt and Offenbach. Even if my last name sounds English, I'm fully German, and my English is not the best. I hope you can follow my short lecture. I want to present the Siedlung Braunheim in 3 paragraphs. First of all, and for me, it is the most important item in considering Braunheim is the urban layout. After the urbanism, I want to zoom in and introduce the houses using the example Am Ebelfeld 199. And in the end, I want to appoint my personal advantages and highlights. So this is an overview from 1936. You can see the satellite Braunheim, housing estate of Braunheim, built in 1926 to 1928. The planner was Ernst May with his team of Hochbauamt Frankfurt. It was situated between fields outside the city center of Frankfurt. On the map today, you can see that it's now integrated in a new urban context with industry and new settlements. I accentuated the streets Damaschke Anger and Am Ebelfeld. I think it's a special and a typical urban figure because of the interesting arrangement. On the one hand, you see the clear lines of the buildings. On the other side, the urban reaction to landscape and natural particularities. The river Nidda and the Ebelfeld Hill evoke the characteristic bend of the street. Now we zoom in into the neighborhood around Am Ebelfeld 199. On the first slide, you can see a street view. The street is full of cars and the houses are various colored. In the first time when I was driven in the street, I was shocked by the strange diversity. Knowing that the ensemble of the Siedlung is protected. Beside the streets, you find footways and garden paths. They represent a second structure in the district. They are very important for families and their children as an extended playground and for the whole neighborhood as a place for exchange. Even garden path parties are organized among neighbors. The buildings are forming the borderline to private space. Behind the buildings, there are the private gardens, and I call it also neighborhood space. It is very interesting that each garden is just 6 meters wide, but about 30 meters long. Often there are no fences between the gardens, and sometimes, in the best cases, it looks like little parks when 3 to 4 gardens are combined. And a specific characteristic of the Siedlung Braunheim is that there are 3 big plots of land with rentable parcels, organized by the settlers' community. So I continue with the houses. The houses were built in 3 time periods. Here you can see a view of the urban settlement in 1930. The facade were colored in red, blue, and white. The designer of the color scheme was the famous Hans Leistikow. The picture on the left shows our house at the time before buying it in 2012. The facade was in a poor light green. The plastic windows had new proportions, and there was a heavy wooden door in a dark visual appearance. In Germany, we call it like Gelsenkirchener Baroque. The aim of our restoration was giving back a sort of honor to the house by reinterpreting and remembering the ideas of the past without falling in a one-to-one restoration. We wanted to rebuild the house for necessities of a family in 2013, not in 1927. On the collage, the main topics are listed, like windows, technical installation, surfaces, facades, stairs, waterproofing, roof. So I go on with the with the ground floor. Our intent was to respect the spatial arrangement and the topology of the house. So we didn't enlarge the floor plan by an annex building to the existing house, which is often done in the Siedlung Braunheim. We removed walls and combined living and dining room in order to get a big family room. The other rooms stayed in their original location with only little modifications. Also, the old tiles we renovated, and today you can see them in the corridor. On the left side, it's an image in 2012. On the right side, it's an image from today. On the first floor, all the walls remained on the same place. To compensate the minimum on square meters, we restored the building cupboards from the 60s, in the sense of using the maximum space. Stairs and corridors are dark and obscure because they are in the middle of the house and get no direct daylight, so we choose bright colors. And now the second floor, it's the only floor we interacted clearly. A second bathroom was installed on one half of the surface of the terrace. For us, it was a reasonable compromise, not losing the possibility of fresh air, but also having a second bathroom. On the roof, we installed solar panels for solar heat. They were placed in a way you can't notice it directly by passing the street. Now the resume. In the resume, I want to present my personal keywords and advantages. The topic of conservation and reinterpretation accompanies us in living in the house till today. Transforming the ideas of the past in modern contexts is a great challenge and a pleasure. It's interesting that so many people contact us for consulting us in details. For me, the houses represent a great self-conception, self-confidence, and implicitness. I like this balance and regularity. You don't have to come up with something special. The simple structure allows good organization of living in the houses till today. The section shows the efficiency in regarding, for example, the clear heights. They are different from floor to floor. The ground floor, where people spend most of their time, has the largest height. On this way, the heating volume rests on a minimum. In the end, we realized that the heating costs are very low in comparison to the square meters. Small envelope and big volume. The possibility of transformation you can see in the details of the facade. And the garden terrace is for us and for all the residents an extra room of the house, just outside. Not only since Corona time, this is a very important room communicating between in and outside for us and for all the inhabitants. Last but not least, for me, one of the most advantages in the Siedlung Braunheim and in the Siedlungen of Neues Frankfurt is the strong correlation between the buildings and nature. It's not only the house, it's especially the surrounding and the urban layout which constitutes a significant additional value for all the residents of the housing settlement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cornelius Boy. That was very insightful, and I think you did a tremendous job in renovating so thoroughly and even, well, extending it in a very good way to our current condition. So let's switch over to Tel Aviv. Brad Pinchuk, what is your side of the story when living in a monument-protected building and city?
Okay, good evening to everybody. I'll share my screen. I am a practicing architect, but my office is not an office that deals regularly with conservation. However, I do live in a neighborhood which has been listed, and I'm going to give you the residents' insight into living in a listed neighborhood. Okay, the neighborhood is called Kiryat Meir, on the name of one of the first mayors of Tel Aviv. Here we see an aerial shot of Tel Aviv in 2020. Marked here in the red rectangle is the neighborhood, which is composed of 12 buildings. 10 of them are exactly the same. And on the eastern edge, there's a slightly different typology, which makes a gate into the neighborhood. This is one of the major streets of Tel Aviv, called Ibn Gviro, which is a commercial and residential street that runs from south to north. This is the Ayalon stream on the eastern edge of Tel Aviv. And on this side, we have the western edge, which is the promenade and of course the beach and the sea. If we go all the way back to 1945, so you can see the neighborhood again here, the 12 buildings. This is that main street, Ibn Gviro, all those years ago. This is the Ayalon stream running here on the east, and the beach and the sea over here on the west. Tel Aviv is still very much a small town and very much hugging the coastline. The complex was designed by an architect who won a competition at the end of the 30s and was built in the early 30s. Judith Segel was her name. And here you see historical photographs near the end of the building period. You see these are the typical buildings, of which there are 2 rows of 5, 10 in all, and at the eastern edge, which is you can't see now, but it's hidden at the back, is the gate building. In historical photographs you see here in Gviro Street, which obviously barely exists, and you see here in the background that neighborhood. Again, slightly closer, and here in the background of a popular gathering. And the neighborhood, this is the eastern building, which is actually 2 buildings joined in the middle, and you can make out here on the ground floor, the central part of the 2 buildings is raised, and it makes a gate into the central garden of the complex. And this photograph is taken from one of the central military bases in Tel Aviv, which obviously has since been built up and has changed very much. There were certain central issues in the planning of the complex. One of them was the kitchen, which you can see here, a plan of the original kitchen. It's not the original kitchen in the photograph, but it's a similar kitchen. This, of course, is in continuation with issues which were being raised in Europe at the time, surrounding the kitchen. And what you see here is one of the ministers of Israel, Golda Meir, and a very, very famous photograph of her in her kitchen with the family and parliamentary people she used to host in her kitchen. So the kitchen was a very central issue to this complex, and the idea was to make it a central part of the apartment, and to allow the house to be run from the kitchen. The complex in plan is composed again of 12 buildings, 2 rows of 5 around the central garden, and the building on the east, on the screen, it's on the right-hand side, which is here on the ground floor plan. You see the gateway that raised central portion makes into the central garden. This is a photograph from the west towards the east, where you see that central raised part of the gateway building. The garden is yet to come into full bloom, of course, and you can see the 2 rows of buildings that hug the central garden. The problem, of course, in Israel as a resident is basically this. And that is, in a small country of approximately 9 million people, we have 13 parties that were recently elected into a parliament. None of them is capable of making a government. And we're a country where rules, regulations, and the law in general is nothing more than an unnecessary irritant. And if possible, we would prefer to ignore any and all of them or pretend they don't exist. Show you some photographs, more recent. This is the Eastern Gateway building. These are some photographs from the central garden areas. You can see that each resident is a law unto himself or herself. and builds and closes and renovates and does whatever he feels is necessary, he or she feels is necessary, and makes their lives more comfortable with absolutely no regard to the building they're living in, to the fact that they're living in a shared building, and that they have partners who are also owners of the building, and that they should possibly speak to them before they do anything. And the buildings are, of course, in a terrible state. They're cracking, they're leaking. There's no insulation, not acoustical or thermal. They're sinking into the sand, into the soil, and they're basically disintegrating. I'll show you, this is a typical plan in one of the, typical apartment in one of the typical buildings. The entrance is here next to the bathroom and small toilet which was existing. This was the kitchen. There were 3 rooms, the entrance hall, and 2 terraces, a small terrace to the east and a larger terrace to the west. And I'm showing you this because I'm showing you 3 plans of the same apartment as renovated by 3 different residents. Of course, there are probably 100 different plans because each person did something else. But you can see here a plan which is close to the original 2 rooms to the here next to the entrance hall. The bathrooms stay in the same place. The kitchen has been retained in the same place. The terraces, which is very typical in Israel and in Tel Aviv, have been closed and become an integral part of the internal space of the apartment. And they enlarge the living room, they make the dining room possible, and they enlarge that bedroom. 2 other options here, the bedrooms are on the other side, the living, dining, kitchen area over here. The bathrooms have been moved to the opposite side of the apartment, and what was originally the bathrooms has become a bedroom. So possibly you can say that the architect was maybe too successful in her planning because she made apartments, made spaces which are very, very flexible and anybody can do anything. I bought an apartment in this complex 16 years ago. And since I've moved in, I've been dealing as a representative of the residents, one of the representatives, have been dealing with the complex and trying to examine how we can renovate and upgrade and improve and restore the complex to its original state. Here you see a typical building which is comprised of 4 apartments around 2 vertical staircases, 3 floors each building. That's the current state. There were various, this was a proposal which was pushed forward by the residents themselves, and we were trying to examine, together with the conservation department of the council, we were trying to examine what the boundaries of extension and renovation would be. This was an attempt to add a new western terrace, which would replace the original terrace and would allow the original terraces to remain closed and part of the apartments. There is a additional room added into, if you see here, there's a kind of a U-shaped courtyard, which is then filled with additional rooms, and the elevator is made within on the space of the apartments within the staircase. That was one option, and there's an addition of a partial floor on the roof, 2 new apartments, which would help fund this renovation proposal, and that would allow the residents to do the project without having to pay for the renovation. There was also the possibility of adding a floor and then a partial floor, and an external elevator. These are all sketches and diagrams that we examined with the council. And here you can see the original plan on the left and various options of how the building could be renovated and maybe extended, and the apartment made slightly larger and an elevator added. And of course, how all of this would affect the complex. In section, you see the original section of 3 stories, and the courtyard in the building, next building in line, and the additional floor. And we were also examining the possibility of an underground parking system. And that was one of our 3D views of the complex once this had been done. There's an extra 1.5 floors added to the entire complex. Of course, all the green outdoor spaces have been renovated and dealt with. But the buildings are bigger and slightly removed from their original state. There was another attempt that of course failed, because more than anything, you can't get 150 residents to agree on anything, certainly not in Tel Aviv. But also because there was a lot of hesitancy from the side of the council and the conservation department. There was another attempt which suggested rebuilding the entire eastern elevation. What's marked here in purple is actually in addition to the entire building, which just copies the entire eastern elevation 2 meters to the east. That also didn't go forward. And the current plan, which is what I'm showing you now, and I saw on the list of participants, I don't know if it's Amnon himself, but I saw the name Amnon Baol, who is an expert in conservation, one of the leading conservation architects in Tel Aviv, and he is part of the team that is pushing this plan forward. The current plan is to add that extra room in the courtyards to the west, to add the elevator internally on a space which is taken from each of the 2 apartments, to reinstate and renovate the landscaping according, or as close to the original plan as is possible. And if that's the original state of the complex, then that's the suggested change, which is basically dealing with the western-facing terraces, which have already been closed anyway. If you remember the photographs I showed in the beginning, there's an attempt to do it in an organized and sensitive manner, which would allow the building to retain some kind of vision of the original vision without reducing the size of the apartments. In aerial view, that's the original complex, and that's the new complex, which basically is just reinstating the shared space on the roof, which was also part of the original plan that can be used by all the residents, reinstating the green spaces, and fitting these, you see it here, fitting these courtyards with the additional room to each of the apartments. That's taken 15 years, and we're still probably 7 or 8 years from seeing this happen.
That is a long story.
And as we speak, the apartments and the buildings are crumbling around us.
Wow. Yes, there we are.
That's the reality of conservation in Israel.
I think we need to discuss if conservation in its strongest sense makes sense if it takes 15 years to change nothing and have it still crumbling. I think that's a story we can all discuss at length and also other projects. But first of all, I would like to say thank you to Sheridanburg in Sydney, Australia, where it is by now, I think, 4 a.m. in the morning. And I thank you very much for participating, and we look forward to your introduction of conservation planning at the Sydney Opera House before we start our discussion. A very warm welcome from Frankfurt to the other side of the planet. Thank you, Sheridan. Let's see if that works.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation from the museum to speak, and I'm hoping that somebody on your side of the world can work the slideshow for me. I was a little hesitant about doing it from this side because sometimes we do have some difficulties with internet connections where I am at the present time. We also have a cyclone bearing down on us at the present time as well. So all things considered, better for you to be doing it. It's fabulous listening to the 3 talks before me, because it gave me a very good sense of the issues that are being dealt with. And it's interesting to think of the contrast which an opera house presents, because surprisingly, the German and the Israeli housing estates have very similar problems to the sorts of problems and issues that have arisen in Australia with the Opera House. I'll tell you a little bit about its history. If someone could bring the slideshow up on screen. We're working on that. Okay. All right. So the reason why it's interesting to look at the Opera House at the present time is that in 2013, it started what's called the Decade of Renewal. And that Decade of Renewal needed to approach a number of ongoing issues and difficulties that we were having with the site. So the next slide, please. The house is a very, very busy place. Pre-pandemic, we had just under 11 million visitors a year, of which only about 1.3 million attend performances. So you can see that instead of being particularly a place of performance, it's also become a place of visitation. And that brings a whole range of other issues that were not thought about when the place was constructed. The changing way in which performances are done has also changed the way in which the venues operate. Issues as varied as the way in which the stages and the stage machinery are used to the way in which parking is provided for the site, all bring particular challenges to a site that's on a promontory actually partly built over water. As you can imagine, we have issues around climate change, the changing sea levels, the increase of precipitation in this part of the world is also a major issue that we are starting to deal with. The number of events has greatly increased on site. The forecourt and the surroundings have become places of public exhibition, public gathering in ways that were never previously thought of. The number of tourists just moving through the site, 560 odd, were taking tours in the year that these statistics were done, which are around 2017, 2018. And the other issue that's become a major one is the increase in the provision of food and beverage outlets. Starting with one, there are now about 20 different types of outlets, restaurants, bars, activities, temporary activities that go on. And it's changed from a place with very few permanent staff to about 560 staff. So the pressure for administrative locations and so forth is also a major one. But alongside those issues of the stretch and the strain are also the fact that the economic contribution to the state of this complex is about $1.2 billion a year. That was in 2017 figures, which would be probably 900,000 euro, I suppose. 900,000 million. Yes. Next slide, please. So just to acquaint you with a little bit of the history, the house was designed by Danish architect Jahrhunderts in collaboration with the engineer of Arup. And the building was constructed over a 16-year period, 1958 to 1973. It opened 6 years late and it cost 10 times its original budget. Next slide. Fortunately, that budget was largely funded by a public lottery, but the delay and the budget overrun caused an unable to be resolved rift between the architect and the government. And Jahrhunderts was replaced in 1966 as the architect for the site, and he left never to return to Australia. The next slide, please. The design brief for the interiors was completed by Australian architects Hall, Todd and Littlemore. The exteriors were almost all Jahrhunderts, with some spaces and elements being hybrid elements. The design of both Peter Hall, the gentleman in this photograph, and Jahrhunderts. The house opened to great acclaim in 1973, and it was swiftly Australia's busiest centre for the performing arts. And it became a symbol for a nation that was looking beyond its colonial past and towards a more modern, independent future. The importance of looking after the building physically was evident very quickly. Its unusual and often experimental construction methods and materials have proven very robust, but they've needed careful management and maintenance over the years. Conservation practice was developing very rapidly in Australia in the 1970s, and we created a national conservation charter called the Borough Charter in 1979 through ICOMOS. And it's a very succinct statement of principles and philosophy. And accompanying that professional activity was also state and federal heritage legislation that came in around the same time. And one of the things that all of these processes really emphasised was the conservation planning process. If I could have the next slide, please. So throughout Australia, we've had a practice of creating these plans. Conservation plan is sometimes called in a shortened form. And very simply, they just set out what's significant about a place and what the policies to look after it in the future will be. It's not a repair schedule, which would be seen as a more reactive response, but it's a proactive idea of what will need to happen in the future and how it would happen. It relies very much on analysing what makes a place significant, which is different simply to the bricks and mortar discussion or to perhaps the architectural intent of the original designer. And it means that significance often shifts more towards social values and the importance that people place on it and how to conserve those aspects as well, of course, as the functional aspects. If I could have the next slide, please. At the Sydney Opera House, there have been 4 successive conservation plans. The first was in 1993 and prepared by Jim Kerr, and it set out the significance of the site that's been reviewed each time there's been a new plan done. And the policies in that plan have shifted as the pressures and the needs of the site have shifted as well. It'd be very easy in a conservation plan for the Opera House to simply say, well, look, it's an architectural masterpiece and the policies have to concentrate on the fabric of the building. And yes, some of them do. But why the house is valued is its social and its cultural significance. And that requires a different kind of analysis and understanding. Just as the first CMP was being completed, we had an extraordinary opportunity to re-engage with Jorn Utzon. And in 2002, the Utz and Design Principles were developed. These were done by the 3 gentlemen you see in the centre photograph, distinguished architect Richard Johnson, Jorn himself in the centre, and his architect son Jan. And together they drafted the Utz and Design Principles, which became the basis for the current Conservation Management Plan. They also resulted in a number of changes to the building and extensions to the building undertaken with Jorn and Jan Utzon's supervision. The Conservation Plan and the Utz and Design Principles have become one of the major communication channels that are used by the multiple stakeholders of this place. Everybody from the politicians to the resident performing companies, ballet and opera, to the tourists and the people who are responsible for the asset management work. I love the sketch on the right-hand side, which Jorn did during this process, describing the process of taking all the thoughts that he had about the place for the future and setting them down on paper. He was a very modest man, and he believed that change would always happen to the Opera House. It would never be set in stone, so to speak. It would alter and amend, and new architects and new visions would need to be accommodated within the building. The next slide, please. I've found over the years in my practice in Sydney that the conservation planning process can be adapted to lots of different kinds of buildings, from the Opera House to the wonderful Abraj al Kuwait, the water towers that are symbolic of that nation, observatories such as the left-hand side there, Mount Stromlo in Canberra in Australia, the wonderful Kenzatangi Stadium in Tokyo, a modernist house in Sydney in the top right-hand corner, and the Eames House in Los Angeles, all of which have been wonderfully responsive to the conservation planning process. That process, if I could have the next slide, is of course based on planning principles that you'll all be familiar with. From the Venice Charter onwards through the World Heritage Convention, this need for a plan of some kind to guide the looking after these places has been around for a long time. And one of the documents that I draw your attention to is the 2017, what's called the Madrid-New Delhi document, which is in full. It's called Approaches to the Conservation of 20th Century Cultural Heritage. It's a particularly useful document. It's around on the internet, and it provides specific advice towards 20th century places about planning for them. The next slide, please. One of the other things that's happened in the last 10 years in particular has been the sharing of good practice about conservation planning through the Getty Conservation Institute and the Getty Foundation in Los Angeles, which started this program called Keeping It Modern, which provided funding and grants to some of the places that you see on the screen for the development of their own conservation management plan. So, for example, there are 70-odd places and sites that have now had those plans undertaken, and those plans are freely available on the Getty website, which is a fantastic resource to have a bit of a look at. If I could have the next slide. I have someone's email instead. Perhaps you can...
There must always be a technical glitch, otherwise it's not a live
Yeah,
event.
yeah, that's true. It's not live if it's not having a problem.
We are absolutely live. I have no idea what is happening, but we will get it back in a minute.
Okay. Well, look, I can see on the right-hand side the
you can see it on the, I think everybody should see it on the small screen already, but it's very difficult. There we are.
Okay, there we go. We've got it back again.
Thank you for your patience, everybody.
So the conservation plan is basically telling us how we would conserve, maintain and interpret. And it's interesting to hear Ben's talk about the extraordinary lengths and the combination of interpretation efforts that have been made there. Similarly, the Sydney Opera House has a wonderful website with a great number of resources, some of which are to do with conservation, some are to do with the history of the site. But the kinds of resources that we've been using have been things like 3D laser scanning. We were part of one of the Scottish 10 projects some years ago, which has really helped us in some of the very detailed materials analysis that we've been undertaking. The Opera House is one of the first structures designed pretty much entirely using computer-generated planning. At the time, it was very innovative. Now it's very difficult to actually track some of that because of the way that computers have changed and programming has changed. So having the 3D laser scan was a great boon for us in actually looking at the way in which the place is literally put together. We also have a very strong maintenance contingent of the work that needs to be done there continually. At Centre Photograph is a wonderful guy who actually worked as a rigger on the construction of the site and is now one of our what's called a maintenance engineer. He helps us look after the bronze, and he's developed over the years some wonderful, very homemade kind of techniques for looking after the bronze alloys within the house. And the interpretation of the site is extremely important to us. The lower photograph there is the recent experimental rehang of the wonderful theatre curtains that are no longer present in the house due to some issues around both their conservation and their use by contemporary performing companies. And we've been doing a lot of interpretation to bring them alive to people who visit the site and to those who want to see them on the internet when we can't actually bring them back to the house in reality. And the next slide, please. So the kinds of constraints and opportunities that we face are balancing off that role between being a masterpiece of architecture and a wonderful urban sculpture, as you can see in the photograph behind me, to actually operating as a world-class performing arts centre. And there's a lot of contradictions and tension in that. We have quite aged infrastructure. We had very little accessibility within the property for disabled people. There was a great deal of wear and tear from that level of visitation, as you can imagine, and the impact of the marine environment being built, literally built over water, are quite substantial. When we started to do repairs within the house, we found that some of the timber was not being managed sustainably. So we've actually established ways in which we can support that happening for the future. The information management that I mentioned with the computers was one of the many issues. The site was World Heritage listed in 2007, which added a layer of complexity. We are locally listed, state listed, and federally listed, as well as world listed. So it's quite a deal of applications to be done whenever anything changes. If I can have the next slide. One of the other issues that's come forward much more prominently in the last decade has been the importance of this site to the original inhabitants and continuing inhabitants of the Sydney region, the Eora Nation. That site, that peninsula, was always a gathering site. It was called Tubagali, and the Indigenous people came here on a seasonal basis and regular basis to gather, to exchange information, to feast. And that site is now underneath the Opera House, literally. There's been excavations, which you saw on the previous slide, which have brought forward Indigenous artefacts and evidence of Indigenous occupation, large shell middens and so forth. And now there's a very strong decision-making process. We have a reconciliation plan for the Indigenous people of Sydney to come together on this site again, and that is continually happening, both in the way performances are undertaken and in a whole range of other ways, really. Next slide, please. So what's our approach to change? Well, these are the 4 principles that we undertake, and I want to show you just briefly the decision-making tool that we're using. We try very hard to understand the significance and understand how that significance is changing. For example, the first 3 conservation plans made very little mention of the Indigenous values. The most recent one has really brought those to the fore. When we're making changes, we do as little as possible, just as much as is necessary. We use those design principles, so we try to reflect the changes in the way that Utz and saw them. But we also found that because it's a site that's open 7 days a week, 24/7, we needed very practical and quick decision-making tools to be able to actually manage what was going on at the site. For the next slide. So in terms of understanding what we needed to do, we really needed to know a lot about the site in detail. That some elements of the place were much more important than others. The sails, the tiles, the way in which they're managed. Some are intrusive or not significant. Previously, there's a historic photo there in the centre. There was a conference centre and restaurant, a temporary establishment on one of the boardwalks at the side. And we also need to respect the layers of change, because some of those may well be significant. And on the left, this is the only Jahrhunderts and designed interior in the house, one of the projects that he did when he came back. We have to work through each of those concepts with thinking about which attributes are significant. Is it the material? Is it the form of the place or the location? Or is it the function and the use that is carried out there? The next slide gives you a little indication. I realise you can't possibly read that, but what that is a table that goes through each of the room and each of the spaces in the conservation plan and looks about how much tolerance for change can the form, the fabric, the function, the location of that element take. We work out how significant it is and then work out what its tolerance for change, either positively or negatively, because there are opportunities for change as well, would be. That's part of the planning in the CMP. Next slide, please. And this is just to finish up with some of the works that are going on at the present time. I mentioned to you that there is a difficulty with disabled access in the site. That is the case. Really only the front portion of the site closest to the city has been fully accessible. And the areas to the rear, which look over the harbour and are the major box office, the foyers rather, not the box office, but the foyers, haven't had access. To create that access, we had to actually cut through some major elements of the building. And this has been very controversial in recent years. The photograph on the left-hand side upper is cutting through the stairs to create a passage of access and access to lifts at the rear. It's been very, very difficult to work through, but what we were very fortunate to be able to look at some of the original drawings and find that Utz had, in fact, had an idea about having a passage through there. We were able to connect that concept, which never came to reality, into a contemporary way of connecting through to lifts at the rear. On the right-hand side, the concert hall has had a number of attempts to improve its acoustic performance, which is good but not fabulous. And so we've had a series of engineers look at the way in which the sides of the room may be readjusted. And in fact, the location of the orchestra dropped because, as you might imagine, the sails of the Sydney Opera House are on a ring beam construction method. Cutting through that ring beam is a rather major issue. So looking at how we could drop the floor of the orchestra pit was a very big engineering issue. All of those works have been underway in the last couple of years as part of our renewal program. The next slide, please. There's also been a construction on that rear area where I mentioned to you there was the intrusive a temporary location for a conference centre and restaurant, and a new restaurant has been created within the plinth of the building. You can see the light on the right-hand side and the final construction on the lower levels there. And the next slide, which I think is the penultimate slide, is one of the projects that we've been working on in the tapestries in the building. The major slide is the curtain of the moon. The red slide is the curtain of the sun. These were the two major tapestry curtains hung within the building at its construction by artist John Coburn. They unfortunately had a range of conservation issues associated with them, and they were also not functioning very well for the resident companies. They were taken off the site almost a decade ago and put into storage. And over the last year or two, we've been able to bring them back and rehang them in the house, have another look at the conservation issues, see if we can use contemporary technology to look after that, and created a whole interpretation series of videos and so forth around it, which you can have a look at that location on the screen at the present time. The next slide, I think, is the final slide. The CMP that I've been talking about and the methodology is available on the website with a lot of other material. It's called, instead of just calling it a conservation plan, it's called Respecting the Vision, which gives you an idea of the fact that in doing these 4 conservation plans and looking back on each of them, the respect with which Jorn Utzon was held and his conception for the building has always been a major issue in looking after it today. And the final slide, thank you. I hope you've enjoyed seeing the slides and have a look at those podcasts. And I'd be very happy to answer questions and, of course, participate in the debate. I think it's quite surprising how much we have in common with the issues that we're all facing, whether it's achieving more car parking or achieving access in a more equal way, or recognising other layers of significance for the site. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, Sheridan, your presentation is exactly the point where I want to go back to all the housing estates and ask, was anything ever considered for Frankfurt, the Siedlung, for Berlin, the Siedlung, or for your housing estate in Tel Aviv, something like a conservation management plan where it was defined what could be changed and how it could be changed? Or is that still something which rather goes to the big projects? I open the floor to anybody who wants to say first, but maybe Markus can say something from the urban planning department, Markus Quechenberger, of what has been done in Frankfurt, or if there has been anything done already, or is it coming up in the future?
You're starting. So this discussion is very interesting and very important for us because we learned a lot of about the situation in Berlin I think it's very interesting, very good to discuss about the situation in the neighborhoods, to show some details, to organize a website where you can find some details, some plans for your houses. And I think we can also learn from the other cities, from Tel Aviv and also from Sydney, because I think we have to talk about the vision of the heritage site, and not only about the details we find. Because when we talk in Frankfurt about the Neues Frankfurt, and also if we talk with the inhabitants about the Neues Frankfurt, they said to us, this is not a museum, we live here, this is a flat, this is my garden. And I would like to live in this neighborhood, and I would like to develop also my neighborhood and my house and my garden. And so I think it's very important to have such management plans like we talked about or heard about in Sydney, and also I know Berlin has such management plans, and also Tel Aviv. And in Frankfurt, we are at the beginning. We have the support of the federal program, Nationale Projekte des Städtebaus, and with this program, we would like to organize and develop some management plans for 3 settlements, for 3 neighborhoods, for the Heimatsiedlung, the Römerstadt, and the Riederwald. And in the next years, we would like to develop with the inhabitants. The inhabitants are mostly public housing companies. Would like to develop these neighborhoods. So, but we are at the start.
Okay, before I ask Cornelius Boy, what do you think? Would you like to be part of developing a vision for your housing estate, for the entire one?
I think I'm still part of it, because as I said in the beginning of our discussion, it's the neighbors of us which are contacting us and which are demanding such details. They want to know how does it. Where did you get this door? Where did you get the windows? Which materials do you need for this vision of housing? So I think we still do it in our small house, but you have to enlarge it. You have to scale it to get this vision. I think it's necessary, and I was very impressed about Berlin, how they are starting, and about the details when Buschfeld presented. It's very good organized, I think.
Ben Buschfeld, right over to you. How long did it take you to develop this website, to get the first details and plans on the road, and how is your conservation management plan going, and how did it get started? Because I understand you have one, or Berlin has one. Yeah, I'd also want to add something.
Yeah, of course, there are many heritage management plans in Berlin. Usually, it's like the Federal Authority of Monument Affairs commissions scientific expertises about how to maintain and to keep a certain monument. If I come to the question, well, I guess you relate to the database that we put on about the Hufeisensiedlung. This was actually a media transfer, because before we put up the website, there were very detailed scientific expertise by Winfried Brenner and my wife. But the problem was that it's a bit complicated in Berlin, that the district authority, who is responsible, didn't have enough manpower to deal with 600 individual owners. So my basic idea was, well, if this whole stuff is just one single paper copy and we can't reach the appropriate people, then we need to put all this stuff online. But doing so, we could draw back on the work of Winfried and Katrin. And I developed the concept 2007. This was actually the reason why the association was founded, in order to apply for funding, which proved to be quite difficult. It just happened in 2009 when the German government put up a funding project. And then it took us 1.5 years to put down this website. It's over 11 years old by now, or 10 years old. So it needs to be maintained, but you can see, I can put it in the chat line. There's really incredible detail in that. And this is necessary because we got privatized. Normally, and then it's much easier if it's a big housing association, then you just apply to the appropriate monument authority and ask what you can do. And if there are a series of thinking, well, certain issues like climate, security, energy saving, things like that, you need to ask specialists to develop solutions for that and then communicate it. I hope I answered the question in a way.
Yes, I think from your perspective, yes, you did. But I would like to hear more from Jörg Haspel, who was very much involved in the entire housing estate becoming UNESCO World Heritage Site. How did you, from your end of the Monument Protection Authority, go about it in developing this monument or this conservation management plan?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this inspiring presentations and for the possibility to compare it, these different approaches. I think in Berlin it was somewhat like a work in progress, because we decided, or we choose to nominate housing estates in the 90s. And so it was very early, and in this time, all this housing estates were owned by public societies. So it was rather easy to develop a plan. And then it was suddenly, it was partially privatized with the row houses. And that was one of the problems we had to manage. And we tried to find inhabitants or people who want to buy it, like Ben Bushfield, his wife, and so on, who are a little bit enthusiastic in Bruno Taut and in modern architecture, because that's much more easier. And it's interesting that when it became a World Heritage Site at the beginning, there was a lot of criticism, and some of the people were hesitating if it is good for them, and some were scared that it is a gentrification which will be developed or supported and endorsed by the World Heritage certificate. But now it has changed. It's the houses, the architecture, and the owners and the people who are living there, they come together. So there is something like an enthusiasm, or it's more appropriate than it was before. And I hope that we can continue this process. But what is very important, what Ben Bushfield mentioned, that the idea of creating a conservation management plan, which is available for every owner, for every resident, for every tenant, was fantastic. And it was because of privacy protection reasons, we were not allowed to publish it and to make it accessible to everybody. And that is a big handicap, because we do not have to hide anything about these details, about the colors, about the results, because we want to make people interested and to follow this example. So we have to think about how can we enable residents as well as the owners to take care of their monument, because it's their heritage. It's not the heritage of the state conservationist or of anybody else. And that is very important. May I add one question which we did not yet discuss in Berlin and which I did not see in Frankfurt, and maybe the only one was Sheridan, who mentioned the question how to update these buildings to become barrier-free and to become accessible for handicapped people. And I'm always asking myself, how can we organize this? Maybe in public houses or in concert houses and theaters, it may be easier, but especially when you have these row houses or the apartment buildings, the residential areas, that is a big problem if we want to guarantee that people can live in their houses lifelong and that they can stay there. And so my question is to Ben Buschfeld, or also to Bud Pitchock and to the others from Frankfurt, to Mr. Boy. How do you think about this? And do you have any experience in the housing estates to manage this this problem, or I would call it a challenge? It's a challenge like energy saving measurement.
Brad Pinchuk, I think in your plans, you discussed also integrating an elevator to the housing estate. Maybe you can also say something, if at all, a conservation management plan, which I think sounds like a very good tool to look forward, has been tried to be established in your housing estate in Tel Aviv. And how are you trying to get this barrier-free access with integrating elevators? What do you think?
Yeah, well, first of all, in Tel Aviv, we have a conservation plan for all the listed buildings in the city. The conservation plan basically adds building rights to the various buildings as an incentive to renovate and restore and conserve the buildings. So it's an economical incentive. Most of the buildings that have undergone conservation in Tel Aviv are buildings which are owned by one family or one owner, or acquired by a single developer, and then he can empty the building of owners or residents, and he can do whatever he likes. And then, of course, he runs a negotiation with the conservation department, what the conservation plan for that specific building will be. Okay, there's no specific outline in advance. In our case, there is no single owner. There are 150 or 160 owners, and to get 160, certainly not in Tel Aviv, but maybe also not even in Berlin or in Frankfurt, to get 160 different owners to agree on anything is close to impossible. And of course, the issues, each one has his own issue, and access is one of the issues. There are people who it is very important for them that there is an elevator, that they can continue to live in their apartments into old age, if they're injured, if they undergo surgery, if they get sick, whatever. And the others who are much more interested and much more concerned about solving the car parking problem and don't really care if they do or don't have an elevator. And of course, all of these issues need to be weighed up against, together with the conservation of the complex, the modernization of the complex, because the demands change. Accessibility is now a demand, which I think is a basic right of any owner. Insulation, thermal and acoustic insulation are basic issues today, etc., etc. So the various issues which the conservation plan in Tel Aviv doesn't take into account, didn't take into account, doesn't make provision for in advance, and they rely on as kind of a planning, negotiation of planning, which sometimes is more successful and sometimes less successful. But one of the major issues is this kind of wide-ranging ownership, which doesn't, you can't run negotiation with 150 owners and the conservation department. I mean, it's impossible, it doesn't work. And the issues are too varied, and each person has his own single specific concerns, and couldn't really be bothered to kind of, overcome them and look at the greater good and say, okay, let's just get our building in order. And that's a very major problem. And I think the council, in our case, I think the council needs to be much more proactive and decide how they want it done and what are the issues which are significant and need to be non-negotiable. And I think they even need to, there are laws in Israel which would allow them to force us to do something, which they are very reluctant to enforce. And I think they do need to start using these laws, because otherwise nothing's going to happen until the buildings are gone.
And just one question, I think you raised your hand, and I also have a question for you. Are also the 700 row houses you mentioned are also owned by the same housing organization, or are these privatized?
Nearly all the houses are privatized by now. So people who moved in these houses really need to care about these barrier-free access themselves. But this is hard because the staircases are very narrow, which will be true for most of the social housing projects. So you can build in a lifter, but then it's not very comfortable. If we consider the whole housing estates, there's one good example. One or two of the 6 housing estates in Berlin are owned by a cooperative. And the one cooperative managed this in a way that they reserved the ground floors for the elderly or the disabled people. And then they added some kind of wheelchair ramp to to something like a loggia, which is in the ground floor, but lifted up like 3 or 4 stairs. So the main interior or the main entrance is not really touched. And these ramps can easily be hidden behind some bushes and things like that. And they also built a new block, which is especially a serviced apartment thing, but very nearby the old neighborhood and in a similar style. So I think these are quite good solutions, but actually they need to have some kind of cooperative ownership structure behind that.
Thank you. Anything from your side?
The situation in Frankfurt is similar. But in Frankfurt, we have many of the houses are in ownership of the public housing company, and they have also other flats. So if you have a need of barrier-free flat, you can also rent another flat. So, for example, Nassauische Heimstätte, they are the owner of the Heimatsiedlung, and they have such a program to organize then a barrier-free flat for older people, for example, or organize a flat in the ground floor of the Heimatsiedlung.
So they would switch.
They switch the flat.
The flats.
Yeah.
I think in the single family houses, it's a big problem because we have also the narrow stairs. And I know from some inhabitants that they live only in the ground floor. They don't live in the first and the second floor. So they are looking to install the toilet and the bathroom in the ground floor because you can't go up.
Could you, Cornelius Boy, could you imagine something like what Brad Pinchuk also described in adding a level of lodges, very similar to La Carton Vassal? So also my question to Tel Aviv goes, if La Carton Vassal would, as they just won the Pritzker Prize, if they would propose such a architecture extension scheme, do you think that would be more successful? And can you imagine this happening in your housing estate?
I can imagine it only for one single family house. I can imagine it for a row. I can imagine that it could be a solution also to make it barrier free. But I can't imagine it for a single house. And also in Frankfurt, in the Siedlung Braunheim, this is all private. This is not a Wohnbaugenossenschaft like Nassauische Heimstätte. I think in this case, this would be also a solution to consult such good architects like La Carton Vassal to make a proposal.
We have a strategy for some private houses to add a room on the ground floor, but not on the upper floors. So to extend the ground floor. So this is possible, for example, to build a new toilet or something, or a little bathroom in the ground floor. That's allowed.
So how is it in Tel Aviv? Do you think that getting La Carton Vassal on board would help with the, discussing things with the conservation authorities?
They may have learned. They may have learned from our conservation plan, because our conservation plan is the addition of a floor, a partial floor. That's the basis, and that partial floor is supposed to provide the economic base for renovation. It's not always enough, but it's a base. I think it's very much dependent, if you ask me and not the Pritzker Prize winners, I think it's very much dependent on the building. There are buildings which can take on another floor or another partial floor and still retain the qualities that are there, that because of those qualities we're conserving the building. And there are buildings which are very difficult to add to without losing those qualities that you're trying to conserve. So it's a very much in my opinion, very much a site-specific or building-specific issue. And I think that's one of the advantages of our local conservation plan, that it allows for negotiation per building, and there's not one consistent overriding plan. But of course, they're welcome. We're welcome. We would be happy to have them.
All right. Okay. Let's see if they listened and participated in our discussion. Sharon, you also wanted to add to our discussion.
Yes, thank you. I think, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So, of course, the context is very important. No, I mean, one has to understand that Tel Aviv as a World Heritage Site is in the center of town, and it's not just an estate. It's more than 4,000 buildings in the center. And there is, of course, a much larger development pressure than perhaps in the outskirts of a town. And I think it's even almost an ethical question, or for me at least, it starts to be an ethical questions. Like, how much can we really hold on to like an icon, or freeze sort of a time where this was built and this kind of typology was right for that sort of culture at that time, without adjusting to the needs of our society today. And I think, of course, it's also a cultural issue of how much change do you allow. But I think nowadays conservation at large needs to maybe adapt to the pressures of the issues we're dealing with today. So one of them, of course, is to make the apartments as accessible as possible, so the people who live in these buildings cherish the buildings enough to want to live there and take care of them. So I think a management plan is good if you have an enclosed area which you can define, like what Ben Bushfeld described, like the typologies of windows and doors are quite similar. There's such a variety in Tel Aviv that you can't even start doing one sort of typology that would be right for all the buildings, because they are planned by a lot of architects and not only by one. So I think it's really as we said before, it depends on the buildings themselves. And I think in Tel Aviv, every building tells us a different story, and we have to observe each and every building before we make sort of a general management plan.
Thank you, Sharon. Inbal, you want to add to our discussion? Hello.
Hi, hello. I'll be brief. Thank you for these wonderful and fascinating presentations. I was thinking that there are two issues that come up, and some of them, as an architectural historian, we've been talking about in research groups that I participate in. One is the need to develop a vocabulary, so to speak, or maybe even a manifesto for dwelling. And I think Cornelius talked about it when he emphasized the terms like flexibility, simplicity, respect to the building, but also usage. And I think the more we develop this vocabulary, it'll contextualize things and help the dwellers participate in this process. And another thing, I'm not a conservationist, but I think that that the things that Sheridan said also really point to a need to dismantle the differences we sometimes have between how we approach conservation of public or civic buildings, which are such big and iconic projects and dwellings or neighborhoods, because it seems on the surface that it's very, very different. But I think the things that came up here, there are a lot of things to think about that unite these situations and these approaches, and thinking about this together, we can probably benefit from how we reuse and respect and continue to conserve across these lines.
Thank you, Inbal. Sheridan, you want to add? And I also wanted to ask you a question, if you could.
If I may, yes. It was to say that the provision of access, improved access, is probably one of the most controversial difficulties that the Opera House has had to deal with. And it took many years to resolve it, and many different plans and many different ideas about how it could be done. And the benefit that we drew from the conservation management plan was that it didn't say disabled access can only go here, it could possibly go here. It wasn't an answer, it was a process. So we had policies which said, well, we try to maintain as much of the original fabric as we possibly can, but then we'd have another policy that would say, but we are trying to enable access as an equitable function of the house. So the designers, and we went through several different designers, I'd have to say, to come to the solution, had to look at all of those policies and say, well, how do we get those to work together? Or indeed, which ones are we not going to be able to resolve? So the issue about cutting into significant original fabric was one that was hotly debated in the press in Australia and with the heritage authorities. So I guess my commentary would be to say that a conservation plan is valuable because it tells you what the policies are, but working it out in detail, whether it's with the Pritzker Prize-winning architect or whether it's with a conservation architect specialising in older fabric, it's not an easy process, but the conservation plan helps you by giving you policies to work with, instead of it just being an individual's idea. And coming back to Sharon's point about the ethics of why we need to do this, we also have several housing estates in Sydney that are going through similar kinds of issues and pressures to put elevators within very constricted spaces. And as the Brad said, I think the need to have a uniform approach on groups in row houses is absolutely essential, but quite difficult to achieve.
Thank you. Would you say that, Sheridan, that developing such a conservation management plan is easier for a large-scale, iconic building than for a large-scale housing estate like the Hufeisensiedlung?
Yeah, no, look, my practice over some 30 years, 40 years has been with conservation planning at all scales. So the distinction that the Opera House has is that it is a very public, very watched building, and it has reasonable finances to support the work that it needs to do. When I think about housing estates in Sydney that I've been dealing with, 20th century housing estates, they are individuals. They are things that have gone out just the same way that the Berlin estates have gone out of government ownership into private ownership. The pressures of individualism and different needs comes to bear. And what we've found and demonstrated repeatedly is that the conservation plan process, so when these properties were sold, by the way, they were sold with conservation plans, which was a great advantage because an incoming owner had an idea that there was already going to be some restrictions and some opportunities, and they had a good understanding of why their place was important. So it was slightly different to what happened in the Berlin estates, but nonetheless, it hasn't reduced the amount of discussion that's necessary to find the right solution. It just gives you a policy framework within which to make those decisions and take out those designs.
Thank you. Jörg, do you want to pose your question yourself, or shall I just...
May I ask one question or one comment? I believe that developing conservation management plan, for example, for World Heritage sites, is much more difficult the more owners you have. You have to unify many owners, many very different interests, and that's very difficult. And we realized then when we have a look at the World Heritage list, it is interesting that in some states and in some regions, public owned or Commonwealth owned buildings and sites are listed for World Heritage and not private owned heritage sites, because it is so difficult. And the more owners you have, the more complicated it is, and the more conflicts you are threatened by when you're listing it. So I think it's very different, and that was and that is why it is important always to think about how can you unify the owners of cities, of housing estates, to come together by cooperatives, by building societies, or by an administration, to bring them together so that there is a common ground which can be shared and which can be used as a fundament for the whole conservation management plan. And we will see how it will work in Frankfurt. But I have one question, Sheridan.
How does it work in Berlin? How does it work in Berlin with the? How did you find a common ground, or where there not as many owners as are today?
We have only one housing estate, which is Britz and Hufeisen Siedlung, which is partially owned by many owners. That is what Ben Buschfeld mentioned. And all the others, there are large societies, so it is privatized, but it is in one hand, and you can negotiate how to deal with the balconies, with the roof, with the plaster, and things like this. And you can be sure that from the first house of the street till to the last one, there is a similar solution, because it does not only look better, we believe that it looks better then, but it is also less expensive than to change it house by house, unit by unit. So we will see how it works, but that is the question to Frankfurt as well as to Tel Aviv. When we saw the example which was presented by Bet Puchik, I asked myself, who built this housing estate? Because it looks like a closed housing estate which was built and planned in one hand and in one head, and now it has become privatized, and that is, I will not call it a dilemma, but that's a big problem for.
So Brad, maybe you can jump in with Jörg having a bad connection. I hope everybody sees all right. Brad Funchal, can you say, okay, it was built by one architect, was it also built by one organization and then it got privatized later on?
It was, yes, it was one of the first private but co-owned housing estates that were built in Tel Aviv, in Israel, probably. And they organized a competition, which I think is quite outstanding. And as you saw, a female architect won that competition, which I'm not sure is not also an extraordinary event at the time. And I assume, can only assume because I wasn't around, but I assume there was a much more kind of unified sense of community, much more significant sense of community, and that allowed the complex to be built. And I'm sure it's it's an issue in any country that we become more private and we become more interested in ourselves and our own issues, and there's much less sense of community. And despite the fact that there are these 150 owners around shared garden spaces, I didn't discuss that, but even the garden spaces, which could be a massive advantage for these apartments and for the children and for whoever's living there, they're completely neglected and overrun. And we haven't even managed in those 15 years to agree on the same gardening service and share the cost, and just make sure we have a beautiful garden which we can use and enjoy. I mean, it's that bad. So again, there's a major issue here between the as architects, as conservation architects, as concerned citizens, what we would like to see happen in our cities, and the residents, who each one is interested in his own apartment and his own his own pocket, and is not really necessarily willing to take part anymore in these community issues. And I think that's also a problem at the base of all this, because specifically in a complex that large, that if there was a sense of community, it would be much easier to move this whole thing forward. And what we've seen over 15 years is just arguing and fighting and accusations and etc. It hasn't been a pleasant process.
Do you think, to all of you participating in our discussion, that becoming a World Heritage Site can help with becoming a community again? So in working together for a common goal, do you think that is somehow feasible and possible? And I see, if I look at Ben Buschfeld's website, I think that would be a starting point, or the yearly gatherings you do in the Hufeisensiedlung. Did that happen after or before the World Heritage Site? Ben.
It happened after the privatization. So privatization is always gentrification. You can't really talk around this issue. If houses are on sale, then the upper middle class will move in. And so we invented this kind of street celebration in order to bridge this gentrification effect, in order to get old and new neighbors in direct contact, to create a good climate. And of course, you can try to trigger some kind of, I'm proud of living in a World Heritage, and so we are a community of people living in a World Heritage, by means of social events, by means of design, by lectures, by guided tours, by things like that. This is all things that we actually did in the Hufeisensiedlung. But it's kind of hard work, and you always need some kind of initial input or some key figures who organize this.
In your housing estate, Cornelius Boy, do you have anything like a street festival once a year?
Yes, we have a street festival. I mentioned it. It is on the garden paths. We have these street festivals, but I think also World Heritage could, yes, I don't think that it's the only one which gives a big community and accelerate process for renovating the housing estates. I think, like Ben Buschfeld said, the city is very important for it to give a Aufgabe for all the people, and also it's very necessary, I think, that there are key figures which are showing how it could be living in a monument. Yeah.
So you're one of the key figures, actually, and Ben, you are as well.
I also think you can't force, you cannot force the people. That's not possible, also when it's all privatized. So I think you have to be good example. You have to show your example, and so you can convince the others. I think that's a possibility in housing estates like it is in Braunheim when it's all privatized. I think it's different from housing estates when it's in one hand. So we have other possibilities.
I think it's very helpful to have good examples and to have also an information point where you can get some find some experience about this good practice. And we have here Forum Neues Frankfurt in the Römerstadt, or we have also the Lieblinghaus in Tel Aviv, or the information point in the Hufeisensiedlung. And I think such places are also very interesting, very important for the discussion. And it's not only the World Heritage label, it's, I think, the discussion about the World Heritage, which is very interesting, very important.
I fully agree. Does anybody not agree? Do we have any further input today? Yes, I see Ben is raising his hand, so please go ahead.
Yeah, this is also something that Jörg Haspel said when we made up Tautes Heim. He said something like, nothing beats the power of a good example. If you have some kind of model flat, which is restored in a proper way, then neighbors can get interested in that. And it's much easier to have a look at another flat than to look at plans or visualizations. So I think introducing some kind of model apartments or solutions is always a good idea. And then you can get people to follow these ideas. We actually have a lot of questions from people who said, well, we bought a house in the Hufeisensiedlung, or we bought a house by Bruno Taut or Erich Mendelssohn. Can we have a look at your sample? Can you give us the color codes? Can you give us this and that? This is really a lot of work, but it proves that this is a possible concept to create models.
I have one last question to everybody. Okay, we're talking about 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. We talk about the great significant structure of the Sydney Opera House. But that's also what Jörg asked. How can we deal, or how will we deal with architecture layers more recent or young in time? Will we make the same mistakes and just discuss in about 50 years' time what we are going to do about from the 1950s architecture, or can we be more clever in coming up now, maybe with a management plan of how to extend? I mean, I'm thinking here in Frankfurt, in the 90s, we have the Berliner Straße, which is right in the city center, where we have 1950s classical housing structures right in the middle of in the inner city. And we're talking about that the inner city will change because everything is changing in the inner city, not only due to Corona. And how are we going to do about with the 1950s structure or 1970s? I mean, if I think about all these large-scale housing estates, large scale at least for German perspective, and at one point, will they be torn down, or do we just have them run down and then we change everything? Do you think we can be more wise learning from our discussion today, already today? What do you think? Anybody can answer.
May I respond to that?
Yes.
I think that part of the answer is understanding why those 1950s estate or any era place is significant. What makes it important to conserve it? And then to share the information in the way that Ben's described and others have described. I might just mention that I was fortunate many years ago for Jörg to take me around the Berlin estates and to see the Taut house, which was just at that time beginning to be restored. And the architectural guidelines that were available to homeowners of the Berlin estates as part of the World Heritage Program were in fact influential on some of the work that has been done here in Sydney in looking at the way those guidelines were written and adapting them into similar cases with row houses here in Sydney. So that sharing of information is something that I think we all have a really strong responsibility to do. And that's what the Getty Foundation has been doing with all their Keeping It Modern program. But to answer your question very directly, the 1950s and the 1960s in Australia was a period of great architectural expression because we were coming out of a period of post-war austerity where it had been very difficult both to access what was happening architecturally and also to access materials which were going into the war effort and so forth. So we are looking very closely at the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, even into the 80s now. And what we're seeing is a lot of research, a lot of sharing of architectural interest, which is now broadening out into a community interest. So we're seeing a larger group of people, of younger people coming through and specifically looking for those kind of estates and houses to be buying into. And that's where this conservation planning process is really important, because if you understand why it's significant and you look after why it's significant, then it's a much easier prospect to see them being conserved into the future.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Some other thoughts? Well, then these are most famous words. Thank you, everybody, for such a lively discussion, which I really enjoyed and which I think is at least very fruitful for our situation here in Frankfurt, and I hope also in Tel Aviv and in Sydney and in Berlin and all the other places where we had participants in our discussion. We will be back, let me have a look, with our next discussion. We might just go back to the housing estate of yours, Brad Fitchuk, the role of female architects and feminist architecture in modernism and today, which we will start on Thursday, 6th of May this year, again online. And I'm sure we will have as interesting participants and panelists as we have had today. Then our third discussion also touches some topics we had today, from roof wall to rooftop facilities. So the idea of how the roof will be used, can we improve the use, or rediscover the original use. That's Thursday, 10th of June. And then our hopefully last online discussion is on Thursday, 8th July, the evolution of modernism and its perception in society today. And again, we will pick up on something where we just finished the discussion. How does this entire looking of evolution of modernism is today, and we end up, and we will discuss most likely the 70s and the 60s and 50s and all this, and maybe even the 90s, the postmodern architecture, since I think we're now entering the postmodern architecture era, as I've seen some styles coming back to very colorful houses. And that's on the Thursday of 8th of July. And then I really hope that we will manage, after the summer vacation, a live event, a real live event here in Frankfurt, with hopefully lots of visitors from all over the world, or we can maybe do a parallel event, one in Israel, in Tel Aviv, one here in Frankfurt, and have the technology that we can really discuss different issues in 2 different rooms in 2 different countries more. I mean, we're doing fine so far. We can expand on that, but hopefully, and we have
I'd
more.
prefer to be on a plane and come to Frankfurt if it's all okay with you.
And I really look forward to our next discussions. And I hope you enjoyed the evening tonight. And for those of you in Germany who need Architektenkammerpunkte and you listened via Zoom and participated via Zoom, we will send the list of participants to the Architektenkammer Hessen, and they will acknowledge your participation. That's one point for tonight's discussion you will receive. Thank you very much. Thank you also to you here in Frankfurt participating, and to everybody supporting all these online events. And I look forward to our next discussion on 6th of May on female architects and feminist architecture. Thank you and goodbye from Frankfurt.
Goodbye.
Thank you.